J.K. Rowling is a closeted trans man. Change my mind. J.K. Rowling is absolutely closeted trans. Read her open letter. She so lacks awareness, she doesn't even realize she basically said so herself. Now, I firmly believe J.K. Rowling is a secretly self-hating trans man. Snoop Dogg at least bi-curious, and Nick Fuentes and Andrew Tate, a bunch of closeted gay. This person is really getting their money's worth out of one comment. Snoop Dogg at least bi-curious merch when? These are all comments, unfortunately, on my video about the conspiracy theory that all homophobes are just secretly self-hating gays and hiding it. And they're referencing this essay by Joanne Keyboard Rowling. If I'd been born 30 years later, I too might have tried to transition. I believe I could have been persuaded to turn myself into the son my father had openly said he'd have preferred. This essay has been doing a specific kind of dirty work since 2020. It gets cited, it shows up in parliamentary debates, and eventually, inevitably, in your shitty little family's WhatsApp group. Now my family's, of course, because in this house, we can't read. This essay is treated as a serious intellectual contribution by people who would like you to believe they're having a serious conversation. And part of why it's convincing is that it sounds like confession. It sounds like someone paying a personal cost to say something very difficult and therefore very honest, and therefore beyond questioning actually, if you think about it, which you shouldn't. It's like she's telling you a secret from her past. I might have been one of them. I was a tomboy. I wore jeans. I read books. I had a personality. I was basically a man at 12. What kind of monster would accuse my own story of being strategically deployed? I'm Caelan Conrad, and I'm on the floor because I threw my back out. And we're going to reverse transvestigate Joanne Keeps Posting Rowling.
The best thing about being a woman is the prerogative to have a little fun. Go totally crazy. Forget I'm a lady. Men shirt, short skirts. Really go wild, yeah. Doing that in style. Get in the action. Feel the attraction. Color my head, do what I dare. I feel like a woman.
When you search J.K. Rowling is a trans man, one video comes up first.
What do you mean you didn't know that J.K. Rowling is a trans man? So I mentioned to a friend that J.K. Rowling is a trans man, and I was actually really surprised that they didn't already know this.
This is activist and creative Eli Ehrlich, a trans woman who by all accounts seems to have a long and prolific history of standing up for the rights of trans people, despite consistent harassment and abuse from anti-trans people like Matt Walsh. Do not go comment something unkind on her videos or socials due to this single sort of weird take. We all get one. It's our right, afforded to us by the Bill of Gay Rights, to be wrong. This video by Eli makes all the arguments I saw scattered online, and it does it in one place, which saves me from having to dig through 17 Reddit threads at 2 a.m. So thank you, Eli. Let's watch it now.
In interviews before Rowling went full TERF, he was actually pretty neutral on trans issues.
Committing to the bit by using he, him pronouns is kind of funny, although it does kind of imply that all trans men use he, him pronouns. They don't. Sorry, I'm being the friend that's too woke again.
He even admitted that he longed to be a boy.
Did you wear similar clothes?
Oh my God, yes.
Different colours.
Yeah,
but
you always had pink, and I always had blue.
Because you were the boy, Joe?
Yeah.
If you weren't used to cutting hair, wouldn't you approach it in a gentle, slow manner?
Wouldn't you go to a hairdresser?
Well, maybe they could, but wouldn't you just cut it slowly and not attack it like a hatchet?
Because you were the eldest.
Yeah, and I was supposed to be a boy, so...
Simon John.
I was supposed to be Simon John. I even know who I was supposed to be.
Oh, they told you?
Oh, yeah.
She was a massive disappointment.
Yeah. And so then I said quite hopefully, and when Di came along, were you disappointed too? No. I said, was that because you found out it was quite nice to have a girl? No. So then I just went upstairs and wept.
It's pretty clear that he was so hurt by not having the opportunity to transition that he now has to force that same pain onto other trans people. Rowling claims that it wasn't a realistic possibility to have transitioned in the 1980s. But we all know that teenagers have been transitioning medically for, over a century, at least the 1920s that we know of. Come on, he even publicly picked the name JK to sound more like a man. The same for his other pseudonym, Robert Galbraith. This doesn't excuse any of his behavior whatsoever. I'm just saying that it makes sense. We should never blame our own community for our suffering, but in this one particular case, it does make sense why he's going after us.
Okay, we're not going to watch it all. You get the general idea. Oh, general idea. I didn't realize you'd be on base today. To summarize, here's the evidence that Eli and most versions of this theory actually rely on. She said she likes blue, and there's nothing more manly than having a favorite color, even if it's one of the girly ones. She had short hair, did what she dared, even if she hated it. Her father wanted a boy and was disappointed she was a girl and not something like a puppet made of wood, which could easily be turned into a boy. Joanne could not, and this upset him. Her? Both him, the dad, and her, Joanne. She thought life would be easier if she weren't female, which, to be clear, is something most women have expressed. And I know this because I'm not just a feminist. I'm a pockets rights activist. I'm listening and I'm learning. She also used gender-neutral or masculine pen names as a female writer in a misogynistic world, a thing literally no cis woman has ever had to... Wait. Now, forgive me my immense and frankly load-bearing skepticism here, but it seems like every single one of these points made in this video is a complete misread of what she said, intentional or otherwise. Load-bearing is so funny. Bear your load on me, daddy. Load-bearing merch when? Do I say load weird? Sound off in the comments, babe. On a scale of 1 to 10, how Canadian is my load? What are they talking about? Oh, forgive my huge load-bearing skepticism here, but it also seems like the theory that Joanne is a trans man rests on the premise that being a trans man and being a woman who struggled with misogyny as a girl are not only conflatable, but interchangeable. Which sounds like something a TERF would say. And what did Mummy say about saying what the TERF would say? Fucking stop it, eh? But I will have and do forgive anyone who is deceived by her essay, who finishes reading it and has a bit of a TERF brainworm whispering in their ear, because that's the entire point of Joanne's essay, to instill in you her ideological yerk, whose entire job is to convince you that trans boys and men are simply wounded girls who have been tricked and groomed into trying to escape the perils of womanhood by becoming men. And as long as people on the left and many queer and trans people are falling for it, I now feel the need to pull back the curtain, show the manipulation, and explain how it works. I learned how from my friend Dorothy and her disgusting little dog. We'll get to the essay in a shortly, but the relevant bits TLDR'd are: Joanne thinks trans men aren't real, they're just sad girls who got tricked. That's it. Oh, and Joanne's daddy was right, she is a disappointment. He was hoping for a boy. We were hoping she wasn't named in the Epstein files. Who was more disappointing? I guess we'll never know. You might think that Eli was shitposting when she posted this video, because I did. So I looked into it, and turns out this was addressed. In a Facebook post with the video, Eli said, "Of course J.K. Rowling is a trans man. He talks about transitioning constantly. He says he was supposed to have been born a boy. He even chose not one, but 2 masculine names to represent himself with. This has been known in the trans community for years. Rowling wasn't allowed to express himself when he was younger, and instead of transitioning later in life, he wants others to be as unhappy as he is." I'm only half joking here. We should never blame our own communities for our suffering. But in this particular case, it's glaringly obvious that Rowling is punishing others for his own pain. Never's just a 6-letter word, that's what I always say. The issue here is you cannot state fairly common experiences for women as being evidence that someone is a trans man, but only for a single person without splashback getting on other people, because any attempt to do so simply reinforces Joanne's anti-trans worldview. So when you say J.K. Rowling is secretly a trans man, you are not owning her. You are, in fact, agreeing with her premise that being a trans man is about the displeasures of being a woman under patriarchy. This is not your assertion. She got there first. You are not owning her. She was showing you how thoroughly she owns you. And does she not own enough already? She already has a castle with a drawbridge and a real-life troll that lives under it. In her video, Eli quoted, but barely touched on, The essay. The essay that launched 1,000 shits. But I want to, because this isn't just Joanne's bullshit talking point. It's extremely pervasive in gender-critical spaces. Gender-critical spaces almost sounds academic and reasonable, which is the point, but it mostly means Twitter, the Nazi bar of the internet, where you can find Joanne drinking herself dim every morning like it's her job. And I guess, honestly, at this point, it might be. But we'll talk about that right after these messages. In this case, this is all Joanne's fault. She has spent the last several years being so aggressively, so dedicatedly, so elaborately weird about trans people that some on the internet have collectively decided that the only possible explanation is that she's got something to hide. But what is it? Is it a parasitic black mold inside of our castle walls? Is it the Jeffrey Epstein invitation thing? Or is it that she's actually a trans? Mostly it just seems like some corners of the internet think she doth protest too much, which I got. Normal people do not behave like this. Normal people do not wake up every morning, open their laptop, and choose to be J.K. Rowling. In fact, she's the only one who does. Every day, day or night, rain or shine. Honestly, a little inspiring, if you don't think about it, which I do recommend. Not thinking is the bread and butter of our society. Through her book releases and her court cases and the complete implosion of her cultural legacy, she's first and foremost a TERF. Dedicated, consistent. It's Orwellian. No, it's Unwellian. She wrote an entire essay about trans people spooking her out, which she promoted as being her little manifesto about, and I'm not making this up, the TERF wars. Get it? It's a pun about property. I guess you had to be there. And honestly, I think the worst part of all of this is how it's affecting me. Because I had to sit and comb through every single word in this thing in order to debunk it. And the extra shitty part of that is that when you don't have any obligation to be honest or explain yourself, a single sentence can rest on so many assumptions and rely on so many fabrications that it takes 20 times as long to counter it as it does to read it. Hence the runtime of this video. I'm going to have friend of the channel, superstar, and adult human comedian Suze Kempner read out the relevant bits because my English accent sounds like I'm solely relying on having heard the accent of Dick Van Diesler's character in Mary Poppins 20 years ago. Because I am. The following is the relevant chunk of the essay that people such as Eli are referring to when they say she admitted she wanted to transition, or she said she would have transitioned if she could.
Most people probably aren't aware, I certainly wasn't until I started researching this issue properly, that 10 years ago the majority of people wanting to transition to the opposite sex were male. That ratio has now reversed. The UK has experienced a 4,400% increase in girls being referred for transitioning treatment. Autistic girls are hugely overrepresented in their numbers. The same phenomenon has been seen in the US. In 2018, American physician and researcher Lisa Littman set out to explore it. In an interview, she said, parents online were describing a very unusual pattern of transgender identification where multiple friends and even entire friend groups became transgender identified at the same time. I would have been remiss had I not considered social contagion and peer influences as potential factors. Littman mentioned Tumblr, Reddit, Instagram and YouTube as contributing factors to rapid-onset gender dysphoria, where she believes that in the realm of transgender identification, youth have created particularly insular echo chambers. However, her career took a similar hit to that suffered by Maya Forstater. Lisa Littman had dared challenge one of the central tenets of trans activism, which is that a person's gender identity is innate, like sexual orientation. Nobody, the activists insisted, could ever be persuaded into being trans. The writings of young trans men reveal a group of notably sensitive and clever people. The more of their accounts of gender dysphoria I've read, with their insightful descriptions of anxiety, dissociation, eating disorders, self-harm and self-hatred, the more I've wondered whether, if I'd been born 30 years later, I too might have tried to transition. The allure of escaping womanhood would have been huge. I struggled with severe OCD as a teenager. If I'd found community and sympathy online that I couldn't find in my immediate environment, I believe I could have been persuaded to turn myself into the son my father had openly said he'd have preferred. As I didn't have a realistic possibility of becoming a man back in the 1980s, it had to be books and music that got me through both my mental health issues and the sexualized scrutiny and judgment that set so many girls to war against their bodies in their teens. Fortunately for me, I found my own sense of otherness, and my ambivalence about being a woman, reflected in the work of female writers and musicians who reassured me that, in spite of everything a sexist world tries to throw at the female-bodied, it's fine not to feel pink, frilly and compliant inside your own head. It's okay to feel confused, dark, both sexual and non-sexual, unsure of what or who you are.
That's a lot, I know, but it needed to be read without breaking it up so you can see the full context of her claims. Candace Owens would have put the whole thing in between 16 sponsors while merch floated on the screen and a countdown timer ticked towards something called the Conspiracy Bundle drop, so let me have this. Please? This passage is genuinely difficult to argue against in casual conversation without looking like a bit of an ass. And I want to be clear that this is entirely intentional. It's written by someone who's very practiced at choosing her words to carefully step around the holes in her logic. Someone who is more than willing to use her own struggles to substantiate her propaganda. It has the texture of careful, reluctant, personally costly reasoning. It performs vulnerability. I might have been one of them. Sidebar, side note, off script, but Homegirl speaks about not being trans like people speak about not going into their scheduled shift as a window washer at the World Trade Center on 9/11. I'm so grateful I didn't go into work. That plane might have cracked my fucking egg. This false admission of hers is delivered in a way that feels like it should immunize against the accusation of her speaking in bad faith because it's a feeling based on her own personal experiences. How could we possibly contest those? And that's the point. It's using the aesthetic of genuine inquiry to deliver conclusions that were almost certainly reached before the inquiry began. It reads like somebody looking inward for answers, thinking out loud. It is not. You're being manipulated, and not just in that one way. There are several, so I made a list because I'm an August Virgo. By which I mean I have sensory issues, I'm extremely literal, seem uninterested in other people, have social anxiety, need to have the same routine every day or I begin to want to shake and scream, and when I was a child I would go mute for hours. It's wild how sometimes astrology is the only explanation for something. Manipulation 1. The UK has seen a 4,400% increase in girls being referred for transitioning treatment. This has been debunked so many times that the claim itself should be embarrassed, but it's load-bearing for everything she says next. So here we go, again. I looked for which peer-reviewed study this stat was sourced from because obviously Joanne didn't provide it, and what I found was an article by Julia Serano, author and friend of the channel, who also went looking for the stat, and she also couldn't find it. Luckily, Julia did all the hard work for us, as per usual, and in her article explaining assigned sex ratio shifts in trans children, Julia writes,
I initially searched for this statistic on Google Scholar, but found no research articles, which suggests that it doesn't come from a peer-reviewed study. The most likely source, as several people pointed out to me, is this article from The Telegraph, a UK newspaper, quoting a British politician.
Great. So the stat isn't peer-reviewed, though it was reviewed by some peers, but they're Joanne's peers, so they probably spend their days suspended from ceilings and bell towers waiting for nightfall so they may feast again. If only they needed an invitation before entering conversations online. What that article also mentions is that referrals for boys have risen as well. So it used to mostly be trans girls, but now it's completely shifted narrative is itself completely shifted. Out the window. It's gone, girl. Because here's what Joanne left out, again from Julia.
Expressed in percentages, that would be a 1,250% increase in trans female/feminine youth. Yet anti-trans campaigners never seem to quote this later statistic.
But say the statistics were accurate, which is likely not, due to the fact that it's not. The first thing to notice is what the statistic is actually measuring. Referrals to gender identity clinics. Not transitions, not surgeries, not medical interventions of any kind. Referrals. This is a measure of how many people sought an initial assessment at a specialist clinic. That's it. That's the whole thing. Someone called a number and made an appointment. The conflation of referred for assessment with referred for transitioning treatment is not a neutral word choice. It is doing more work than most people do at their jobs. It frames a referral, which is the beginning of a process involving extensive assessment resulting in many different outcomes, not automatically leading to any particular intervention, as though it was a pipeline with one entrance and one exit and no off-ramps. You know, like a pipeline road. You go in a confused kid and you come out surgically altered, apparently. That's the implication. That's what transitioning treatment is doing in that sentence. The 4,400% figure also needs context that Rowling does not provide, presumably because the context kills the statistic. The baseline was tiny. Referral numbers were low at the start of the comparison period. And here's the thing about percentage increases from small baselines. They sound fucking insane even when nothing is happening. Over the span of 9 years, referrals went from 40 a year to 1,806 for girls and from 57 to 713 for boys, according to the article she is likely referring to. Phrasing it like that instead of 4,400% really changes the tone, eh? What sounds better? Attendance rose from 1 to 45 or attendance rose 4,400%? My grandfather's follower count rose 4,400% last year. He went from 1 follower to 45. He posts photos of his promotional mug collection. He doesn't know what a reel is. Should someone be writing an essay about my poo-paw? Also, and this should be obvious, but apparently needs saying, referral numbers went up during the exact period when gender identity clinics became publicly known about. When the stigma around seeking help decreased, and when waiting lists became a news story. More people knew the service existed. More people felt safe enough to use it. Referrals went up. This is how services work. This is how everything works. Bit suspicious, isn't it, that after all these people knew about your services, they started all inquiring about him? What's that all about? Honestly, that was... I should have just read that quote myself. That was great. Putting accents on my resume. I swear, gender-critical people see conspiracies fucking everywhere. Like, minimum 5 times a week, I think about this one woman from the gender-critical Facebook groups I infiltrated as Carol Marinera, concerned mother. She saw a cereal box with a pride flag on it that said, together, as in, like, community. But she didn't see together. No, she saw through it to what it really said. Together or to get her. Yes, again. So no, an increase in referrals is not by itself evidence of any social contagion. It's not evidence of much at all, other than we know there are more referrals. Referrals for autism assessment also increased dramatically in the same period. Nobody serious then concludes from this data that autism is a social contagion or that autistic people are being manufactured by peer influences, that they may not even exist at all. Well, I don't, Joanne might, and many gender-critical people do, and you can sleep uneasy knowing that she does not actually seem to care about the poor autistic girls. Nobody who follows gender-critical anti-trans ideology does, nor do they speak for them. My dear friend Evergreen made a video on this exact topic, which everyone who likes my stuff will absolutely love, because she's so fucking funny and smart and gorgeous, etc. It's linked in the description. Go watch it after this. Go watch it instead of this if you want. I'm not your mom. I'm Angus's mom. I wish you were a puppet. What the science actually supports is this. The increase in referrals do not conclusively show that more people are becoming trans. It shows more people feeling safe enough to talk about their gender. Those are entirely different things. During the Me Too movement, women came out in droves to call out the abuse and violence they suffer, to stand up and say, I am a survivor. In a climate where being open about your experiences became a little less stigmatized, more women were willing to take the risk that comes with coming out of the survivor closet, to borrow a term. When it became safer to speak, more people spoke. That's it. That's the whole explanation. Is this evidence that these women are the victims of a social contagion? That they were convinced that perfectly consensual experiences were actually abuse in retrospect? Of course not. To imply that is rape culture. But following Joanne's logic on the social contagion theory, well... Manipulation 2. Lisa Lippman researched this phenomena and suffered professional consequences for daring to challenge trans activism. Well, first off, Lisa Lippman's study on rapid-onset gender dysphoria has significant, well-documented methodological problems. But let's start with the most important one. There's no such thing. They made that shit right up themselves. Rapid-onset gender dysphoria is the fake-ass condition they invented to explain why you didn't know your child was trans until they told you. It isn't because they knew for some time and didn't have the words to express it and then came out of the closet. It's because they recently caught the trans from a friend or a piece of media, like how I got scabies from watching the movie Bros, which, to be clear, I did not deserve, and I will be proving that in court. Joanne is boo-hoo-hooing about people not taking Lisa Lippman's study seriously, but guess what? Fags don't care about your... Facts don't care about your feelings, Joanne. Well, you know what? I was right. Fags don't either. And I speak for all of us, even though I'm such a tomboy. So yes, fags, but also facts, because science, for those who can afford it, is a free system that tells you how to understand the world around you in a way that controls for the biases of the Scientologists, let's call them. But Lisa Lippman wasn't doing a science. Lisa Lippman was doing an ideology. Her study is the equivalent of asking the townspeople of Salem in 1693 whether witches are influenced by the devil, and then publishing their answers in a peer-reviewed journal. Spoiler, they said yes. The witches were not consulted, but they were subsequently targeted. This study Little Miss Shipman conducted involved recruiting participants exclusively from websites that are explicitly anti-trans, like Fourth Wave Now, Transgender Trend, and Youth Trans Critical Professionals. These are not neutral populations. These are communities defined by anti-trans ideology and denial of trans youth identities. They didn't ask trans youth anything, not one question. They asked parents, self-selected anonymously from explicitly anti-trans forums, to report on their children's gender identities, which were never verified. Because this study is, at its methodological core, a poorly made online poll. She asked people who already believed trans identities were socially caused whether they thought trans identities were socially caused. They said yes. Science! I think Rose Schmitz, the world's best potter? No, this is not the video for that. Sculptor? What did her profile say? Trans kiln witch and ceramics artist. Someone buy me one of these, please. What? Rose's Blue Sky post, I think said it best.
Sorry, transgenders. We looked at the stat that famous charity Gill-Peterson provided, and looks like we gotta stop your bodily autonomy in healthcare. Would we need the kids whose lives we're going to ruin? How these psychopathic to look crime children in their face as they beg to keep their autonomy and then ban it with fabricated evidence? That would be unconscionable. And you all know we are not like that.
It's like the judge going to the prosecutor and being like, if he's guilty, just let me know so we don't have to do that whole boring trial with, like, evidence. This isn't a new tactic. It's the same playbook that said gay teachers would turn kids gay. Julia Serano has a name for it: contagiousness politics. Contagiousness politics is a term of my own making and refers to attempts to placate the dominant majority's fears that they might become infected or contaminated by a particular marginalized group. For LGBTQIA+ people, such fears have typically centered on the assumption that straight people can be turned queer via interacting with us. This is something they've always done. They just haven't always done online polls to try and prove it with science. The methodological problems were significant enough that the journal that published it issued a correction and the author was required to revise the paper. This is not what Joanne says. She says republish, which doesn't say anything about having to make a correction, which seems like a very interesting thing to leave out. Intentional, almost, one could say. Here's a possibly relevant fact. The concept of ROGD has not been adopted as a clinical diagnosis by any major psychiatric or medical organization, because the evidence base for it is, to use the medical term, fucking embarrassing. It is not a thing. Stop trying to make ROG happen. Despite all this, Rowling frames the professional scrutiny Lippman faced as persecution for challenging trans ideology. The actual reason the study faced criticism was that it had serious methodological flaws that would have attracted criticism in any research context. Framing peer critique of bad methodology as political suppression is a rhetorical move, not an argument. If I hand in a paper that's just a drawing of a horse, and my professor gives me an F, that's not censorship. That's a horse. And while the saying goes, a horse is worth 1,000 words, my professor specifically asked for 5,000. This horse cannot account for 4,000 words of academic rigor. This horse was not peer-reviewed. This horse has significant methodological problems. My neighbors right now. Sorry. So, proponents of the ROGD conspiracy theory, argue that the main reason we should not allow youth access to any form of trans-related healthcare is that they are likely just not trans, and these stories are held up by accounts like Joanne's. That is the point of them. They argue that trans activists and their doctors at gender clinics are funneling children down a dangerous path. As Shon Faye writes in the Transgender issue, trans people, these conspiracy theorists believe, are part of a body modification pyramid scheme. Having been preyed on and been sold lies about our sex by rich people in white coats, we aim to recruit new members in order to affirm our poor choices. The insinuation that trans people and their doctors are co-conspirators in a dangerous medical fad has worked its way obliquely into the pages of liberal newspapers and news programs. It becomes especially pernicious when the discussion turns to the small number of trans children whose gender dysphoria interferes with their mental health enough to warrant intervention to delay their puberty. The reality, though, is a very different scenario. Almost insultingly, well, actually insultingly so. I might mince, but never my words. I'll give you an example. In Banning Conversion Practices by Florence Ashley, the testimony of a trans woman named Erica Muse is quoted. To me, it highlights how clearly at odds doctors are with trans healthcare and how antagonistic many of them are. I was denied the medication I asked for that was appropriate for my age, but I had to return for more therapy. In each appointment that I came to, he would comment on newly masculinized parts of my body that had been changing due to puberty, parts he could have stopped from developing if he had given me care. Then asked me how I could possibly pass as a woman in my future life. He would berate me for not meeting unknown expectations and excoriated my life at that point. Sessions were not therapeutic, but abusive. Eventually, he relented and allowed me some care, but I think the only reason he did is that I proved to him I couldn't be fixed. I've been suicidal and depressed due to his treatment of me. My self-identity is ruined, and only in the past year have I gained any self-esteem. I live in a body I hate due to him. To me, this illustrates quite clearly that trans people can't even trust their doctors to provide them medical care. And on top of that, that conversion practices aren't just active therapies, but the denial of therapies. Trying to convince you not to seek gender-affirming care is in itself an attempt at conversion. Joanne also states that Littman's work challenged the claim that nobody could ever be persuaded into being trans. She's setting the stage because without these claims, there's no foundation for what comes next. The basis of Joanne's claim, that the grooming trans community might have transed her too, and they would have gotten away with it if it hadn't been for that meddling sense of self. Manipulation 3. If I'd found community and sympathy online that I couldn't find in my immediate environment, I believe I could have been persuaded to turn myself into the son my father had openly said he'd have preferred. I'd like to compare Joanne's story of a cis girl's experience of her father wishing for a son to a trans boy's experience of it. And to steelman this, I'm going to pull one from 1959, 50 years before Joanne retconned herself into almost being trans, much in the same way she retconned various characters into being gay or almost people of color, after the fact and from a safe distance, and nearly 100 years after the childhood she's yapping about. In Histories of the Transgender Child, Julian Gill-Peterson writes on an interview conducted in 1959, where the interviewer, psychologist John Hampson, interviewed a trans man about his childhood in rural New York. In the late 1930s, he left school because of the excruciating sense of embarrassment at being obliged to wear girls' clothes. At age 13, he dropped out of school, but also began working in his family's lumber business, and has dressed as a man since then, without interruption. Patient's father, the report continues, was disappointed that she was female and was always proud that he had a daughter who could work so hard. Patient has dated girls, and several have begun to hint at marriage. At that point, he explains his condition of biological female, but feelings of a man. It seems that this trans man had lived his teenage years in the 1930s and 1940s as a boy, with at least the tacit support of his family, working in a male-dominated profession, and without much difficulty in a rural town. He did not seek out medicine until much later in the 1950s, when transsexuality had become a highly visible subject to the American public. Rural New York, the 1930s. No internet, no gender clinics, no TikTok dance to top surgery pipeline, just a boy in a lumber yard who knew who he was. So a man in a rural town in the 1930s could do this, but she argues she couldn't? Not didn't, couldn't, as in it wasn't possible. As in, the infrastructure for tricking her simply did not exist yet. Joanne's theory does not survive contact with history. It barely survives contact with the paragraph above it. But despite this, she claims that she could have been tricked into doing so, despite her not being trans. Sorry, not tricked. Persuaded. This is the most important line in her entire diatribe, possibly the only important one. The rest is scaffolding. This is the building. Persuaded. Not, I believe I could have been genuinely trans. Not, I believe I could have questioned my gender identity seriously. Nothing internal, nothing self-reflective. She's saying, maybe I could have been told I was trans and believed it, despite it not being true. And to illustrate why she may have been so easily persuadable, a quality usually only attributed to babies, flightless birds, and apparently Joanne Kissinger Rowling, she uses her struggles with misogyny and mental health issues as the reason that someone on the playground could have convinced her she was a boy. Now, many teens struggle with anxiety, dissociation, eating disorders, self-harm and self-hatred, depression. These are common mental health issues, and they're often exacerbated by social pressures and magnified by marginalization. These are experiences that are incidentally heavily influenced by the experience of being trans in a world that is hostile to trans people. But what she's trying to do is conflate that marginalization with the mental health struggles. She's saying, I had mental health struggles too. Therefore, I might have been identified as trans. These are not the same sentence. She would like them to be. But that list of struggles is not a description of what makes someone trans. In fact, not a single one of those things is required in any way to be trans. Plenty of trans people deal with none of these issues to any serious degree or any more than cis people do. And plenty of cis people are in enormous distress. I mean, have you seen what cis people get up to on TikTok? The section of this passage serves one purpose. It's a rhetorical trick she's using to skirt around her claiming that being trans is a mental illness. See, the relationship between dysphoria and mental health struggles is not that mental illness causes people to think that they are trans. The Venn diagram of mentally going through it and trans is two circles that sometimes overlap, not one circle inside the other. And according to most surveys, the overlap is not intrinsic to being trans. It's intrinsic to being trans in a world that contains people like Joanne, which causes distress, which impacts mental health, which she then cites as evidence. I guess it is a bit of a circle, actually. Probably not one of the Venn ones, though. Maybe one of the jerk ones? Rowling is using the co-occurring distress as evidence that the trans identity is caused by or equivalent to the distress. This is the wrong direction of causality, and it's not a mistake someone engaging honestly or carefully with the literature would make. It's a claim a little liar would make. A big, huge, gigantic, petty little liar. It's anti-trans, yes, but it's also just full-blown anti-science. But rhetorically, this move is also doing something subtler that serves her ideological propaganda even further. By identifying with the mental health struggles, I had OCD, I had self-hatred, I struggle with womanhood, she positions herself as someone who understands what these young people are experiencing. I noticed something carefully missing from her descriptions of her hyper-persuadable era as a little tomboy who loved to boy about like a boy, doing boy things in a very boyish manner, like me. It's the one through line in almost every story of childhood dysphoria. That's what's missing. There's not a single description of gender dysphoria stemming from being perceived as a girl. Not one. She didn't include that because she's never experienced that. And let's be so fucking real right now. Homegirl was more femme than I was. This lass has never climbed a fucking tree. There are no moments here where she expresses gender euphoria either, stemming from being perceived as a boy. Not every girl who hated pink was a tomboy, and most of them will never question their gender in any way that calls for a referral to a clinic. Most grow up to be extremely womany women, and some of them grow up to be you, Joanne, apparently, which is definitely worse. Instead, she focuses on the allure of escaping womanhood, which is not about becoming who you are, but escaping who you are. There's a temptation when reading Rowling's description of her youth to say, sounds like she's the trans one. Maybe resist that particular temptation. It's kind of funny, I guess. It would be a satisfying rhetorical device in a book I didn't read. Unfortunately, it is also exactly what she wants, which is a real design flaw in the bit, I think. When you call Joanne a trans man because of her descriptions of her youth, you are not being pro-trans, you are claiming exactly what she is, that trans mass people beginning transition are doing so to escape what they truly are. Women, instead of simply moving closer to whom they truly are, themselves as they see it. Manipulation 4. The allure of escaping womanhood would have been huge. This is the most ideologically naked moment in the passage. So naked, it should be arrested, charged with indecent exposure, tried by a jury of its peers. It claims that a transmasc identity is best understood as a coping mechanism for the difficulties of being a woman under patriarchy. That what looks like gender dysphoria is actually internalized misogyny, a flight from womanhood rather than an authentic experience of being trans. A safe place, a waiting room, essentially. You sit in it until patriarchy sorts itself out. There's a little table with old Woman's World magazines. Nobody ever comes to get you. And this is just a complete reinterpretation of the transmasc experience from the outside by someone who is not trans, not masc, and based on the assumption that her own hypothetical response to patriarchy as a billionaire, as one of the most famous women alive, as someone who has not experienced womanhood the way 99.99% of women experience womanhood since approximately the 1900s, that she's a reliable guide to what trans men are actually experiencing. She is using herself as a control group. She is also the only subject in her own study. She didn't even ask the townspeople of Salem this time. She said, I know a fucking witch when I see one. I wrote the book series on witches. Sweep. She thinks being a trans man is opting out of misogyny, like it's a subscription you can cancel. And because her only application of intersectionality is black women in sports are secretly men actually, she fails to account for the fact that transitioning comes with its own significant costs. And those costs aren't free. Costs very rarely are. There are social costs, medical costs, legal costs, the cost of navigating a world that is frequently and enthusiastically hostile to trans people. The idea that large numbers of people would undergo all of that in order to escape the difficulties of womanhood, rather than because they genuinely experience themselves as men, requires you to believe that being a woman is worse than all of those costs combined. For a trans person, that calculus often makes sense. For someone who isn't, it doesn't. Joanna's not done the calculus. She has looked at the equation and declared herself exempt from showing her work. Instead, she decided that she could simply superimpose her own experiences because she can't see anything else. She is using her own hypothetical, as a cis woman, to explain the minds of trans men and trans masc people. She believes that because she didn't experience her gender in the ways they do, they must be wrong about what they've experienced. This is not stemming from empathy. This is not based on research. This is the self-importance of the privileged masquerading as concern for the marginalized. It's paternalistic garbage. And so is she. In Who's Afraid of Gender, Judith Butler says that, I marked these pages for a reason. I'm so good at this. You were so prepared, Caelan. Thank you, Caelan. Gender relates to an innate sense of lived bodily experience, a sense of who one is, the embodied contours of a self, and for some, the sense of an anchor that holds the architecture of the ego together. To be told that sex assigned at birth is not necessarily the same as the sex assumed in time is unsettling only for those who want to think of their own sex assignment less as a legal act conducted in relation to codified norms than as an immutable truth of the self. Maybe some do live gender as immutable, and that is surely acceptable. But to derive from that experience a theoretical generalization, or indeed a universal rule, is to impose a cruel falsehood on those who are living gender differently. In other words, just because your gender feels fixed and immutable doesn't mean everybody else is. And deciding that your experience is the rule is not you philosophizing. It's not even a hot take. It's just being extremely convinced you're the main character of a story that has, and I cannot stress this enough, billions of other characters in it. By doing this, she also, and this is important, completely ignores what trans men actually say about their experiences, much like Shipman's turf pole. Rowling has read their accounts of dysphoria, dissociation, distress, euphoria, and her conclusion is that they are fleeing womanhood. She has access to accounts written, filmed, and spoken by trans people and has decided her interpretation of those accounts is more accurate than the people who just lived them. She read a diary and then actually'd the person about what they actually meant, how they really felt in those moments. One of the ways we distinguish sentience is by who gets to have an internal reality or a sense of self, like self-awareness. But Joanne treats trans people as though they don't have one. She extends them roughly the same confidence in their own self-knowledge as you might a Dalmatian, which for the record is extremely rude because you should never treat a person the way you treat a scrap of future coat. It's dehumanizing. As Julia Serano writes in Whipping Girl, Another dehumanizing tactic used by these academic critics is the assumption that they are capable of fully understanding and speaking authoritatively about transsexuality despite the fact that they are not transsexual themselves. In fact, rarely do they get to know any transsexuals personally. When they speak disparagingly about transsexuals, their arguments rely almost entirely on other people's research. This is an arrogance Joanne displays in almost everything she does and says. It's the rhetoric of someone who has decided that talking down to people is the same as being right about them.
I love it when a plan comes together. Hashtag Supreme Court. Hashtag women's rights. To those celebrating the fact that I'm smoking a blunt, it's a cigar. Even if it decided to identify as a blunt for the purposes of this celebration, it would remain objectively, provably, and demonstratively a cigar.
She's not a man. She is, however, doing a remarkable impression of one in the specific and unflattering way that's affectionately known as mansplaining. Mansplaining mentioned in 2026. That's a reset. Fuck, I should have said Joanne-splaining. I'll leave it. Manipulation 5. If Joanne was so persuadable, so head empty, so one strong breeze away from being trans by a Tumblr post, what's her excuse for why she's not, a man? Well, she says that she didn't have a realistic possibility of becoming a man back in the 80s. But once again, her mouth is open and bullshit is dribbling out of it. Scat Queen of the Decade, undefeated, retaining champion. Here's the thing about Rowling's claim that transitioning wasn't a realistic possibility in the 1980s. It's not actually true. And the degree to which it's not true is historically documented and not particularly obscure. Trans people transitioned in the 1980s. Some of them were even British. It's wild, I know, but I won't hold that against them. From We Both Laughed in Pleasure, the selected diaries of Lou Sullivan, Lou, who is a trans man, writer, and pioneering trans activist, writes this in his journal sometime between 1977 and 1981. Just got a call from Falk's office firming up my hospital date. He wants to see me for a pre-op appointment. God, I can't wait. What a feeling. My body will finally be mine. I'm to bring his via $1,500 then, and the hospital requires prepayment of $2,000, which should cover the whole cost. $3,500 in 1980? Like $14,000 in 2026? So decidedly not an impossibility. I know people like myself say trans people have always been here, and others will nod and be like, sure, woke, sure. I'm sure that's true in a woke way, wokey, but the 80s weren't like it is today. They weren't really transitioning. That's the point Joanne is arguing here. But again, it's a lie. Whether she's lying because she's willfully ignorant or just trying to harm trans people, that's up to you to decide. But it is an objective truth that what she's telling you is in fact not an objective truth. It's a bold move, but it keeps the brand consistent, I guess. The UK's first trans clinic, Charing Cross, opened in 1966. 1966! That's nearly 20 years before the period Joanne is describing. In the publication Women's World from the 1970s, the services available to trans men at Charing Cross are discussed quite openly. I got my friend Ray to read this. I'm so charming and cute and hot, whatever.
It is estimated that there are at present 30,000 transsexuals in this country. About 140 men and 80 women have had sex change operations, mostly at Charing Cross Hospital, where there is a gender identity clinic. For the female transsexual, the breasts can be removed, although the menstrual periods can of course be suppressed by the pill or male hormones. There are some disadvantages in such treatment. These problems can be avoided by the removal of the uterus or the ovaries.
The option to transition existed. It was difficult, it was stigmatized, it was gated behind significant medical gatekeeping, but it existed. Rowling is not describing a world before transition, she's describing a world where transition could be difficult, which is a very different claim. And it falls apart as soon as you realize transition is also fucking difficult today. But people still do it if they are actually transgender and not just transginger. I do have to say, I don't have to say, but I'm going to say, homegirl moved to Scotland and dyed her hair red. That's got to be some sort of stolen valor appropriation shit, right? No. Show us your arms, Joanne. Let's see the freckles. The devil's marks. She would have survived the witch trials of J.K. Rowling. She simply would have pointed her bony little finger at someone else. Stephen Whittle, a prominent trans activist and academic, transitioned in the UK in the 1970s, which is, and I want to be precise here, notably before the 1980s. And of course, there were others. The idea that a British transmasculine person in the 1980s did not have access to any form of transition is not a description of history. It is a retroactive oversimplification of history to the point it's just untrue. And it serves a specific narrative purpose, which is to make Rowling's non-transition seem like it was imposed on her by circumstance, rather than being simply what happened because she didn't have gender dysphoria and /or wasn't fucking trans. And this matters enormously for the argument she's making, because the argument depends on the absence of the option being the reason she didn't transition. If the option had existed, even in limited, difficult, stigmatized forms, then the reason she didn't transition clearly isn't that it wasn't available. The reason is she didn't need to, which is the obvious explanation, which she has written hundreds of words to avoid saying. And this explanation is the one that applies to the vast majority of gender nonconforming people who don't transition. It's not that the option was unavailable, but that the option wasn't necessary because they weren't trans or didn't need to transition. Joanne has taken the most straightforward explanation for her own non-transition and replaced it with a historical counterfactual that doesn't hold up because the straightforward explanation doesn't do the political work she needs it to do. She is claiming that a ghost keeps slamming her door shut when there's clearly a window open and everyone heard the wind howl through it. The curtains are blowing, Joanne. But the straightforward explanation doesn't warn anybody about anything. It's just a person who wasn't trans not transitioning, which is a story with no moral or rhetorical bite. It isn't something she can weaponize. So it's concealed. Let's zoom out and look at the tone. Vulnerability. The vulnerability is the point. The vulnerability is doing almost all the work. This portion of the essay presents itself as a reluctant, careful, personally costly examination of a complex issue. But every single element of it moves in the same direction. Every statistic, every citation, all of it points towards the same conclusion, that trans identity in young people assigned female at birth is a social phenomenon, driven by distress and peer influence that a different cultural environment would prevent. There is no engagement with evidence that points the other way. There is no acknowledgement of the methodological critiques of Littman's work. There is no engagement with trans men who describe persistent dysphoria that preceded any real community. There is no reckoning with the fact that her own hypothetical, I might have been persuaded, is not evidence about anyone else's experience. In fact, it's fanfic she's written about herself because she had the opportunity to transition and never took it. The performance of uncertainty, I wonder whether I might have, is doing the work of seeming fair while delivering a verdict. The veneer of personal vulnerability creates the illusion that she is someone with skin in the game rather than someone with an agenda. The examples of work like Littman's paper, since corrected and revised, are doing the work of seeming evidence-based while selecting only the evidence that supports the predetermined conclusion. And this is what motivated reasoning looks like when it's written by somebody who is very good at manipulating people. It is political advocacy that's meant to come across as a deeply personal self-reflection and an honest inquiry. And the tell here is that genuine inquiry changes direction sometimes. Like science, it finds things it didn't expect. It follows the evidence somewhere uncomfortable. This essay doesn't do that. It arrives exactly where it intended from the first sentence, having cloaked itself in just enough texture of doubt along the way to make the journey look honest. And it does it all in service of a single thing: to scare people into believing that trans people are confused and should be denied medical treatment or access to gender-affirming care. That's it. The entire talking point boils down to, I was a gender nonconforming kid. Today's culture would have identified me as trans. Therefore, today's culture is identifying gender nonconforming kids who aren't trans as trans. And therefore, the trans kids you're looking at right now are probably just gender nonconforming kids who got a label before they got to become themselves. This is a syllogism built on a false premise. The first therefore only works if she was actually comparable to trans kids. She wasn't. Everything after it collapses. That is the argument that has been cited in Parliament and used to justify revoking healthcare access from minors. A middle-aged person looked at their own childhood, rewrote it slightly to include escaping the specter of something that was never there, and then built an argument against healthcare around that. When I say rewrote it slightly, what I mean is that she looked back at her own childhood and recontextualized her memories based on her current biases and assumptions, and then applied those assumptions wholesale to every trans youth currently alive. And so many gender-critical people do this. Joanne most notably. As evidenced in the witch trials of J.K. Rowling, there is no aspect of her trauma and struggle as a woman she is not willing to weaponize against trans people. None. Zero. She is mining herself for ammunition, and she has not hit bedrock yet. And she never will. And much like in the Witch Trials podcast hosted by Megan Phelps, who once campaigned that gay people deserve to die of AIDS and burn in hell, and who has since decided that actually, trans people are the real problem, Joanne is always presented as someone paying a cost to tell you something true. Not a campaigner, not an ideologue, a person excavating their own past at personal expense in service of a larger truth. The vulnerability is the point. Again, the vulnerability is doing almost all the work. The vulnerability should be getting paid time and a half when instead it gets paid 75 cents for every dollar the facts make. Joanne does this better than almost anyone. She describes her teenage years with genuine emotional texture, the OCD, the self-hatred, the war with her own body, the feeling of not being pink and frilly and compliant enough for womanhood. And then she says, and I want you to notice the move as she makes it, she says that reading trans men's accounts of gender dysphoria made her wonder whether she might have been one of them. Well, might have tried to be one of them. And the reader, if they're not paying attention, goes, oh, she's being vulnerable. She's admitting something. She's risking something by saying this. You don't attack someone who's being vulnerable. You say, that must have been so hard. You do not start fact-checking them in the middle of it. Except she's not being vulnerable. She's being strategic. Because the admission, I might have been trans, isn't actually admission of anything. Because that's not what she said. That's what you remember her saying. It's a rhetorical move that accomplishes three things simultaneously and very efficiently. First, it gives her skin in the game. It's somebody else's skin, but it's skin. She's not just a cis woman commenting from the outside on trans people's experiences. She's someone who was almost affected. Someone who has a personal stake. This immunizes the argument against the most obvious critique, which is, what do you actually know about this? Why are you with the authority here? And why are you speaking with authority here? The answer suddenly is, because I could have been one of them. Because I understand this from the inside. Second, it reframes her position as protective rather than hostile. She's not against trans people. She's worried about people like she was. The confused, sensitive, gender nonconforming kids who might grab the nearest available identity before they've had the chance to find themselves. The way she found herself. The anti-trans messaging gets repackaged as maternal concern, hard-won wisdom, the gift of her difficult experience offered freely to the next generation, whether they asked for it or not. And third, and this is the one that gets talked about the least, it centers her. This fucking billionaire, once again, in a conversation about trans people's experiences, she has made herself the loudest person in the room. The almost trans man woman. The one who got away. The one who just narrowly escaped. The one who could see both sides because she nearly lived on the other side. The final girl of the trans grooming panic. She's Sisney fucking Prescott. Trans people's actual experiences become the backdrop for her near-trans experience. Their dysphoria is the mirror in which she examines her own adolescence. And the whole thing, the whole elegant, infuriating construction only works because it sounds like honesty. It sounds exactly like honesty. It has studied honesty. It knows all of its mannerisms. But honesty does not look like this. This looks like someone who knew exactly where they were going before they started writing. Every personal detail selected for maximum relatability. Every admission calibrated to do exactly the amount of work required without going 1 millimeter further. Every moment of apparent vulnerability arriving at precisely the right moment to deflect the precise critique it needs to deflect. It is, and I mean this as a purely technical observation, very well done. It's also manipulative as hell, and I'd like her to stop, but she never stops. She's like that mascot who never stops. Grimace. Her manipulations require you to extend the emotional generosity you'd extend to someone being genuinely vulnerable, and it uses that generosity to smuggle in conclusions you'd push back on if they were stated plainly. Here's something I want you to pay attention to. For every single person who makes this argument, and there are a lot of them, it is genuinely a career path at this point. There are people with mortgages with turf written under employer. They all describe the same childhood. Not similar childhoods, the same childhood. Same details, same order, same conclusion. It's a franchise at this point. Like a few things people say boys liked, felt vaguely different from other girls, and then later felt like the constraints of womanhood, were constraining them. And then they grew up fine.
I almost had to have braces once, but at the last minute, the dentist realized I had perfect teeth.
Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not saying those experiences aren't real. Girlhood under patriarchy is genuinely difficult. Gender nonconforming girls face genuine pressure. The friction between who you are and who the world wants you to be is a real thing that leaves real marks. I believe these women had complicated childhoods as girls, obviously. I believe these women had complicated childhoods, period. Of course I do. I also believe what they're describing sounds to me perfectly in line with what cis people experience, which is fine, I guess, if you're into that sort of thing. But I noticed something about the specific shape of the childhood being described. It always has a very particular calibration to it. It is always exactly gender nonconforming enough to make the comparison to trans kids feel relevant and emotionally resonant. And never gender nonconforming enough to make the average reader start wondering whether the speaker might have actually had something to their gender identity worth examining. It's funny how that works. And girl, it works. People eat it up like a little white girl who just broke into your house and is about to make herself comfortable with your varied temperature wet oats. She didn't ask. She's not going to ask. She has already decided the temperature is wrong. And she also has some opinions about the seating. Goldilocks. So she set it up. Not too trans, not too cis, just gender nonconforming enough to make the argument work. Just right for her conservative audience. She's describing, in other words, a Goldilocks childhood. But sadly, there are no bears, either to eat her or me. Hey, are you cooking? Turn around. What are you making? That looks good. Okay, so think about what happens if the childhood tips too far in either direction. If Joanne described a completely conventionally feminine girlhood, loved dresses, loved pink, never once felt at war with how she was being gendered, the comparison to trans kids collapses immediately. You can't say, I would have been one of them if there's no version of you that resembles them even slightly. The audience doesn't follow, and the argument from emotion doesn't land. She'd just be a woman who embraced being a woman, telling you trans kids are confused, which is less compelling, even if it's the truth. But now, think about what happens if the childhood tips too far the other way, if she describes something more complicated, more persistent, more specific. If she described not just not wearing dresses, but experiencing her body as actively, privately wrong in ways that preceded the language she had. If she described not just preferring to hang with the boys, but a specific, insistent, years-long interior sense of being a boy herself that she couldn't explain and couldn't shake. If she described the distinctive texture of dysphoria rather than the general texture of gender nonconformity. If she had done that, the reader would start to wonder. And the reader wondering is the one thing this argument cannot survive. It is load-bearing that you don't wonder. The whole thing needs you to not wonder. It needs you to be incurious in the face of her vulnerability. Because the entire rhetorical function of the personal history is to establish the speaker as a reliable parallel to trans kids, similar enough to understand them, distinguishable enough to see through them. But the moment the reader thinks, wait, was she actually trans? The argument inverts. It stops being evidence that trans kids are being mislabeled and starts being evidence that gender nonconforming kids who might be trans don't always get the chance to find out if they are. Because if transitioning wasn't a realistic possibility, maybe that's all that kept her from wanting it. And this is the exact opposite of what this passage is supposed to convey. It turns into she's not describing escaping undue persuasion. She's just still in denial. So the childhood has to be calibrated carefully. It has to sit in the exact middle of the Goldilocks zone where the reader goes, oh, yes, I see. She was like those kids. She understands, without ever going, oh, wait, was she one of those kids? And now she's one of those adults. And Joanne, to her credit as a propagandist, if not a writer, is meticulous in towing this line. Look at the details she chooses. The OCD, the self-hatred, the ambivalence about womanhood, the feeling of not being pink and frilly and compliant. These are details that resonate, that feel real, that beg consideration. But what isn't there? What doesn't she mention? Well, there's no persistent, insistent sense of being a boy. There's no specific grief about being perceived as a girl that goes beyond general adolescent girl distress. The childhood she describes is precisely engineered to make you feel like she understands the trans experience from the inside, while being precisely engineered to never actually claim that she does. The social engineering is efficient, and the seams between two incompatible assertions are invisible by design. Because there is a contradiction here, not a minor one, not a nuance, a full, again, load-bearing, the whole structure collapses if you remove it contradiction that sits right in the middle of every gender-critical argument about trans children, and it just somehow never gets addressed, never gets acknowledged, just sits there holding up the entire edifice, hoping nobody from the Woke Zoning Commission even looks directly at it. But I'm from the Woke Zoning Commission, and I'm looking directly at it. And I'm seeing gender-critical people argue, on one hand, that gender identity is meaningless. It's just feelings. It's just a vibe. It's your personality traits. Certainly not something with any objective reality that should be taken seriously as a basis for medical decisions or legal recognition or any of the things trans people are asking for it to be a basis for. A girl who feels like a boy is just a girl who likes boy things. The feeling doesn't make her a boy. The feeling is just a feeling. Feelings are not facts. This is what the whole gender-critical position rests on. They built a foundation on the crumpled remains of Ben fucking Shapiro. All right, rest in peace, Ben. Minoxidil overdose is a hell of a way to go. He would have wanted us to move on quickly, though, and I will. What was I talking about? Oh, being trans is just a little feeling you have, and then eventually you just grow up and get over it.
The dentist realized I had perfect teeth.
They assert that time and time again. And then, in the exact same piece, sometimes literally the same paragraph, the same breath, they argue that gender identity is so powerful, so contagious, so capable of overriding a child's grasp on reality that a single influential adult or a Tumblr account or a friend group or a YouTube video can reach into a child's sense of self and fundamentally restructure it. Can take a girl who had no particular negative feelings about being a girl and instill in her a persistent, convincing, life-altering belief that she actually is a boy. And it can do this so effectively that the child will pursue medical intervention, endure social consequences, navigate a world that is frequently hostile to her new identity, all on the basis of something that was put there from the outside by peer influence and internet content. But which is it? Is gender identity a flimsy, insubstantial thing that doesn't deserve to be taken seriously because it's just feelings? Or is it a powerful, reality-distorting force that can be weaponized against children by bad actors and must be urgently regulated and restricted? It cannot be both. Not in the way they need it to be both. In that they need it to be whatever it needs to be in that sentence they're currently writing and never checked against the next or the one that came before it. They need it weak enough to dismiss entirely and powerful enough to fear so fiercely it should be the only thing anyone ever fucking talks about again. Insubstantial things don't do that. Flimsy things don't restructure people's identities at the level of depth and persistence that would be required for the social contagions theory to work. If gender identity is just a feeling like preferring chocolate to vanilla, then peer influence can maybe make you say you prefer chocolate. It cannot make you experience profound, persistent distress about eating vanilla. If you sit with it for a second, if you take seriously the idea that gender identity is powerful enough to be installed in a child from the outside through social influence, you have to ask what that model of the mind looks like. You have to ask what kind of child is being imagined, because the child being imagined is a child with no interior life of their own. A child who is essentially a blank slate onto which identity can be written by whoever gets there first. A child who has no pre-existing sense of themselves that would push back against an identity that didn't fit. This is notably not how children work. Children, including young children, have robust and persistent senses of self that resist external pressure constantly. We know this. It is not controversial. It is not a woke assertion. The research on gender identity stability, including in trans children, shows significant persistence over time, not the kind of volatility you'd expect if identity were primarily installed from the outside. But the blank slate child is necessary for the argument, because the blank slate child can be written on. The blank slate child can be saved. The blank slate child needs the adults in the gender critical movement to intervene before the wrong identity gets installed. The child with an interior life of their own, the child who knows something, who is telling you something, who has a sense of themselves that precedes and resists your interpretation, that child is a problem for them. And that child doesn't need saving. That child needs listening to. And listening to children is not what this argument is designed to encourage. It is designed to explain why you don't have to listen to children. And more than that, why you shouldn't. The argument requires a world in which gender nonconforming girls are being systematically funneled towards trans identity, in which the cultural machinery around trans acceptance is essentially a pipeline with one entrance and one exit and no off-ramps. A world in which a girl who hates dresses in 2026 gets handed a trans identity before she's had the chance to figure out that she's just a girl who hates dresses. This world does not exist. The world that does exist, that we actually live in, contains tomboys who grow up to be women and trans kids who grow up to be trans adults. And the difference between them is not that one group was protected from the internet or from hearing about the existence of trans people. Gender nonconforming women who have never once questioned their gender exist in this real world in enormous numbers and are, by and large, straight fucking chillin', hot as hell, living their goddamn lives while Joanne is shitting mold in the hair dye aisle of her pharmacy in her castle while tweeting at some trans person with 10 followers. The girls who are growing up today with access to trans identity as a cultural concept are also growing up with access to butch identity, to gender nonconforming identity, to lesbian identity, to the entire rich vocabulary of gender nonconformity that trans advocacy has largely been instrumental in expanding and defending. The notion that trans visibility has collapsed all of that into a single mandatory identity requires you to ignore basically everything that trans advocates actually say and do, and replace it with a fantasy villain who is out here telling every girl who has ever climbed a tree that she's secretly a boy. That doesn't happen. This trans activist does not exist. The campaign doesn't exist. What exists is a broader cultural permission to explore gender, and broader cultural permission to explore something is not the same as pressure to arrive at a specific conclusion. And the people trying to take that permission away are not protecting children. They're protecting their argument. And it relies on one simple trick. It's the conflation of access with pressure. A world in which trans identity is available as an option, in which a child who experiences gender dysphoria has language for it and community around it and some possibility of care, is not the same world as one in which trans identity is being actively installed in children who don't have dysphoria or who aren't trans. Again, you are not being forced to like chocolate just because they have it at the ice creamery. But gender-critical rhetoric treats the mere existence of trans identity as an option as fundamentally identical to coercion, because if you can maintain that conflation, you can frame every instance of trans visibility as a threat. You can frame a trans character in a children's book as recruitment. You can frame a supportive teacher as grooming. You can frame a gender identity clinic as a pipeline. You can frame a child knowing the word transgender as an act of violence against them. But the conflation only works if you refuse to look at the actual population of gender nonconforming kids and notice that the vast majority of them are doing exactly what gender nonconforming kids do, which is growing up to be gender nonconforming adults comfortable without any gender-affirming medical care. But let's be honest about what this argument feels like from the other side, because we spent a lot of time analyzing the rhetorical mechanics of it, the motivated reasoning, the Goldilocks childhood, the contradictions, and that analysis is necessary, but it can also function as a way of keeping the thing at arm's length, of treating it as an intellectual mystery rather than what it also is, which is a statement directed at real people about the validity of their existence. When Joanne, or anyone making this argument, says, "I would have been trans if I'd grown up today, and I'm glad I didn't," what they're saying to every trans person who hears it is, I looked at what you are, I held it up against myself, and I found you to be less worthy of your own autonomy, story, and internal reality. She has looked at their lives and called it a near miss, her personal I survived 9/11. She has looked at trans identity and called it a bullet she dodged, and then she has been recognized as brave for saying so. And personally, that shit makes me sick. She's a terrible fucking tumor of a person growing from a movement that is a cancer on society. She is the most visible symptom of a disease that is doing real harm to real people. And that's part of why it bothers me so much that people are calling her a secret trans. In my video essay about the homophobes are all secretly gay theory, I discuss the implications of this rhetoric, that blaming a community for the actions of their oppressors does a disservice to that community. And I won't elaborate much on that again, but feel free to watch it as well because the argument is the same. I will say this though, when you say that the most visible, most funded, most politically effective anti-trans campaigner in the English-speaking world is secretly a trans man, when you say that the explanation for her behavior is a repressed trans identity eating her alive from the inside, you have just made a trans man responsible for some of the most effective anti-trans campaigning in modern history. You have taken the most prominent architect of legislative harm against trans people and said, the reason she is like this is that she is one of you. You have made the villain of the story a trans person in denial, which means the villain of the story is, in the end, trans. And I don't think people who make this argument mean to do that. I think they mean to be funny. I think they mean to wound her with the identity she spent years weaponizing against others. But intentions are not the same as effects. And the effect of this particular argument is to hand gender critical people exactly what they need, which is a story in which trans identity is the explanation for cruelty towards trans people. A story in which the community is, at the highest levels, doing what it always does, causing all the harm itself. Trans men deserve better than to have the most high-profile transphobe of the decade hung around their necks as a warning of what they could have been. They are not the road she didn't take. They are people whose existence she is actively trying to make harder, and the least we can do is not make them responsible for explaining her cruelty. Cruelty that has led her to campaign and donate so thoroughly to the anti-trans movement that it contributed in no small part to the recent NHS ban on puberty blockers and HRT for trans people under 18. I know a lot less about this than many trans people in the UK who are reporting on this shit daily, who live with this shit daily. So you should go read their work and follow them and support their journalism by signing up for their newsletters and paying them when you can. I'm fairly protected in Canada, and while I may be so in debt that the Canadian government wants to take my teeth, that's collateral. If you have to choose between the two, I'd rather you skip signing up for my Patreon after this video and supported some of the people doing on-the-ground work to protect trans youth right now across the world. I created a doc of people doing just that. It's obviously not all of them, but I know a lot of them, and they're dope as hell. And I've linked that in the description and the pinned comment, I'm assuming. This has been a lot of words about why some words matter, because they do. More than we remember sometimes. I guess I lied to you a bit. This video isn't about whether Joanne is a trans man. It's about how she's indisputably a transphobe, and actually really good at it. Practice makes pervert, and she is one of the worst kinds of pervert, a cishet one. I have so many videos discussing Joanne's contempt and disgust towards trans women, but this particular claim is laser focused on trans masc people, so this video is as well. I'll link my other videos down in the description if you'd like to check those out too. I spent a year inside gender critical groups reporting on what I found, and much of that revolves around the so-called rapid-onset gender dysphoria in groups for parents of trans kids bent on performing at-home DIY conversion therapy. You should definitely check those out, as well as my video breaking down the Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling podcast. I have an audio drama coming out this year, exciting, with its now permanent name, previously Librarian, called Welcome to Isaiah. You should follow the channel on YouTube and social media so you can stay up to date when it's released. Actually, if you can do something for me, if you're like a fan of the channel, it would mean a lot if you went and clicked the link and just subscribe to that YouTube channel for Welcome to Isaiah and turn on notifications. You need like 1,000 subscribers to monetize or something, and it'd be great if we could like get paid when it comes out. My co-writer on this script, Brona, charming, funnier than me, from the channel Brona is Gay, and I have been working so hard on Isaiah, and we're incredibly excited. I'm currently working on a few investigations, so if you want to follow along with those and get secret information not available anywhere else, you can sign up for a membership on Patreon or YouTube and see them happening live in my members' Discord. They know about all my videos before they happen. If you want to sign up for my Patreon and some other people's stuff, that would be cute. And I would love it because my tax bill this year is about to send me into an early grave. Sharing this video even to your own email tells stupid YouTube that this video is worth watching. So after liking and subscribing, do me a cute, huge favor and do that. You can also check out my podcast, Respect the Dead, where we talk shit about dead people who sucked. like L. Ron Hubbard, Mother Teresa, Gandhi, Fred Christ Trump, that's a real name, and extremely soon, if not before this comes out, season 6 premieres with Charles Kirk. I also have merch. It's cute as hell, and something tells me you look great in it. Love you. Stay gay.
The best thing